Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Sebastián Edwards, who is a professor of international economics at UCLA, who also has worked at the World Bank and written numerous books on Latin American economics, history, and politics. And in addition to other books on finance and economics, the most recent book is this one called The Chile Project, the story of the Chicago boys and the downfall of neoliberalism. Also the author of this book, American Default, The Untold Story of FDR, the Supreme Court, and the Battle Over Gold. Also this book called Left Behind, Latin America and the False Promise of Populism. Welcome, Sebastián.
Greg, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and an honor.
Well, look, maybe we'll start by talking about this latest book, the Chile Project. And I think you're probably in a unique position. I don't think anyone else could have written this book, perhaps, except for you, because, well, not only are you Chilean and have Chicago connections, but you know most of the people who were the big players in this story. And, you know, when we look at the Chilean miracle, or, you know, I think some people call it that, and we look at where Chile is now relative to the other Latin American countries compared to where it was sort of back in the 1970s, it's really a success story. And it's astonishing to me, particularly when you compare it to Argentina and its struggles, and Venezuela and some of the other countries. It's really kind of astonishing to me that there really is still a debate over the drivers of economic growth. It does seem like neoliberalism does what it sets out to do. So I guess, why is it that there's still so much controversy over the economic policies, which sometimes are called Washington consensus, you know, sometimes called neoliberalism, sometimes called free market economics, and so forth?
Well, that's a very deep question, Greg. So let me try to tackle it step by step, or one at the time. I think that what makes the policies still very controversial are two things, or three things. The first one is that they were put in place during a dictatorship. And I think that there is agreement among most people who look at this from sort of a neutral vantage that they could not have been put in place at the time they were implemented. That is in the mid-70s, starting in the mid-70s, without a dictatorship. So there's a very deep original sin there, and that's a dictatorship. The second point is that although there was tremendous growth, as you said, and Chile went from being like the 9th country in the ranking among Latin American countries in terms of income per capita, and became number 1 by a wide margin. So that's tremendous. In one generation, there were two problems related to that. The first one was that inequality remained very high. And there is a divide in views. The Chicago boys in general and the supporters of the model think that inequality is not important. It should not be, and I talk about that in the book, it should not be a objective, a goal of economic policy. I happen to think that it is important, independently of an ethical or moral standpoint. People care about the relative standing within society. And if inequality remains and is high, then you're going to have economic instability. And when you combine inequality with slower growth, then you have a really sort of deadly cocktail. And that happened after 2014, and it made the criticism higher. And the third point is that there were some unkept promises or implicit promises that the supporters of the model made, and that were not did not happen. And that's mostly related to pensions. The fully privately run, not anymore, but originally pension system based on individual savings accounts. And the idea was that if things worked in the way people thought they were going to work, workers would get a rate of replacement of about 70 to 80% of their income. And it turns out that they get about 25% of their income instead of 70, 75%. And people feel betrayed. And if you combine all of this, you get the bad rap that in some quarters the model has. But the reality of things is that there was a miracle. In 1989, which is the last year of the dictatorship, Chile had identical income per capita as Ecuador and Costa Rica. I say that in the book. I show that. Right? Identical. 3,300 and something. The something was different, of course, not, but $3,300 Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Chile. Today, Chile has twice as higher income than Ecuador and 50% higher than Costa Rica, and became, for a while, for about 10 years, number one by a wide margin. Not any longer, but it did happen. So there was a miracle. Now, was it costly? Was it an equal development with inequality? All of that we can discuss, but I think that the notion that there was a miracle should not be overlooked. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, the question that you asked, what was behind that miracle? What were the levers that were pulled and the keys that were pushed that allowed this mediocre country to become a superstar?
Well, I mean, as you point out, it was at the end of the dictatorship where there was parity. And so most of the sort of gap that has emerged between Chile and its neighbors has happened since the end of the dictatorship, right? But the sort of a consultation period, I mean, they continued the same policies, even though you had leftist governments and rightist governments flip-flopping back and forth. The policies remained relatively constant. And so, I mean, it seems to suggest that you have to go through a fairly long period of painful adjustment before you start to see the fruits. I mean, with what's going on in Argentina, I mean, do people have the patience in a non-dictatorship environment to go through all of that suffering before they can see the benefits of these policies?
Well, that's a key question regarding Milei and Argentina, and we don't know. Now, we economists, of course, we think of the evolution of economics or a country through time as a dynamic, complex system. And that, of course, puts this whole analysis in the bucket of differential equations. And differential equations, initial conditions matter, right? So it would be very hard to do what Milei is doing in, say, to go back to a country we just mentioned, in Costa Rica, where initial conditions are, there's no crisis, it's okay. Argentina, will they have patience? Maybe, because initial conditions were so awful. And in particular, the younger generation thought, well, we can do something different. In the case of Chile, many mistakes were made. And the only reason why the model was not changed was because Pinochet was in charge. So I have no doubt about that. Okay. Also, it happened at the time. So if you go back to 1975, Reagan had not started. Thatcher was not prime minister. In fact, the Soviets were winning the Cold War. The Cubans were about to go to Africa to, quote unquote, liberate Angola and so on. So Chile does this, and what Chile is doing is very extravagant. No one thinks it's going to work, and the policy is sort of in an extreme in terms of the whole gamut of policies, and it works. And why did it work? Well, I think that the key element is opening up the economy and allowing the exchange rate to become the most important incentive for entrepreneurs, companies to start exporting. You get a lot of pesos per dollar exported, where traditionally you got very few pesos per dollar exported. So no one exported anything. Right? So you go now to Trader Joe's and there is a whole shelf of Chilean wine. Okay, so Chile, as California, has perfect climate for wine and all sorts of wines. And so you go through to the coast, you get Pinots, and then and in 1973, Chile exported almost no wine. Why? The exchange rate did not make it a profitable thing to do, right? All we exported was copper. So opening up the economy and allowing the currency to find its value was key. And this brings us back to Argentina, because what is happening in Argentina is that the peso is becoming increasingly overvalued. Right? So the peso dollar rate is moving at 2% per month. Inflation was 4, now it's about 3. So costs are going up higher than the currency is depreciating. And that movie we have seen hundreds of times in Latin America. And in 90% of those times, it ends up in a crisis and in a lot of a very costly crisis. So the big question here about Argentina is, will they be able to withstand this period of adjustment with a overvalued currency? And maybe they will.
Well, like, while these policies that Chile has adopted, really, I think in the economics profession, there is a consensus that these policies, make sense, even if there's not a consensus in the general public. But there wasn't a consensus in the 1970s. I mean, the economics profession had a very different portfolio of perspectives than it does now. And the Chicago perspective was considered almost extreme or radical. Right? I mean, in 1973, you were a supporter of Allende, right? I mean, this was something that was a respectable perspective. So maybe you can tell us just a bit about how sort of out of the mainstream were these viewpoints in 1973?
Well, I think that they were out of the mainstream everywhere, right? Milton Friedman was considered to be a great debater, but I would say that in the U.S., most people, and he had a fortnightly column. I think it was in Newsweek, if I remember correctly, and he alternated with Paul Samuelson from MIT. And most people at the time would say Paul Samuelson beats Friedman almost every time. Today, except for economists, no one remembers Paul Samuelson. And Milton Friedman, you can take a flight anywhere in the world and you can talk to your neighbor about Milton Friedman and he or she would know who this guy is. So, but he was considered to be an extremist. And the Chicago boys who were trained under him or within his philosophy, not too many of them took classes from Milton, but they, of course, were influenced by him. They were considered in Chile to be extremists, and they made fun of them. I mean, the name Chicago Boys in a Spanish-speaking country, it was not coined as a term of endearment. It was making fun of them, right? The Chicago, a foreign place, Milton Friedman's home, and boys. So they are young, naive, and they were considered to be totally out of the mainstream. In 1970, there is a presidential election, and former president, conservative businessman Jorge Alessandri stands up for re-election. He had been president before for election, and his main rival is Salvador Allende, the Marxist president. And the Chicago Boys wrote a little sort of economic program for the Alessandri campaign. And when they presented it to him, the conservative candidate, he said, "These guys are crazy. Take them out of here and don't allow them back." And why did he think that they were crazy? Because they thought interest rates should be market determined. The exchange rate should be free. There should be no price controls. and import duties should be reduced significantly, import tariff. Now, reduced to what level, you may ask? 30% on average. And that was considered, so that we put things in perspective, 30% import duties was considered at that time to be extreme, an extreme policy. Today, Chile has 1% import tariffs. I think in the books it's 3%, but since it has free trade agreements with almost every country in the world, it doesn't have any. The exchange rate is floating. Okay, and all of that was going to be totally crazy at that time. And they could only do it, as I said, because there was a dictatorship. So Pinochet had the intuition, I guess, of allowing them to push for the program, even though it had huge costs on the front end. Costs that I am not, if they, it's hard to know if they were avoidable. Okay, and there is a story, of course, of when Friedman goes to Chile in 1975 and meets with Pinochet and tells him that he has to apply a shock policy. And the left has made a lot out of this, right? Naomi Klein has written a number of papers and books and articles saying Friedman's or Pinochet's shock policy impoverished Chile and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to understand how they were able to successfully convince Pinochet to adopt these policies, because I think today, people have this view that you've got the sort of conservatives who are in favor of free markets and liberalization, and the populists or the leftists who are against it. But I mean, if you go back in those times, both left and right supported statist policies. They both supported import substitution, and in fact, the business community, they were not supporters of these initiatives, right?
So there were three groups in Chile: the Marxists, who were defeated in the coup, and not only that, they were imprisoned, sent to detention camps, tortured, and so on. So those guys were out. Then there was the Christian Democrats, which and their views were based on the Catholic Church's social teachings. Mm-hmm. And they favored a system that today no one knows that existed or what it is, and that is the Yugoslavian system of workers managed companies. So Yugoslavia was part of the socialist world, but it was non-aligned. Tito had managed to get out of being under the boot of Stalin right on time. But the Christian Democrats wanted that kind of system. So cooperatives, joint ventures, workers management. But the military did not like the Christian Democrats. And here we have to go into the details and the petite histoire. And the issue was that during the Christian Democratic administration with President Eduardo Frei Montalva, the Christian Democrats treated poorly the military in terms of they didn't approve budgets to keep up their equipment up to wherever they wanted it to be, which is relative to Argentina, Bolivia, and Peru, Chile's neighbors. So they didn't like the Christian Democrats. And there were not too many options. And it turns out that the Navy, retired Navy officers, were in contact with the Chicago Boys, okay? And in a way, serendipity, right? So there was a very wealthy individual, a namesake of mine, Sebastián Edwards, educated at Princeton. At some point, probably one of the wealthiest wealthiest families in Latin America. And he, of course, being very rich, had sailboats and sailed, and that connected him with the Navy, former officers, former admirals, and so on, and they were in a club, and he was the patron of a think tank where some Chicago boys worked. So when the coup came, and actually about a few months before, a retired admiral told the number two at the Navy, there's a group of economists who are preparing an economic blueprint for the next government, the one that is going to
This was the
reshape.
brick,
Yeah,
right?
this is a book, a thick book. It was so thick that it received the nickname of the brick. Okay, and which I analyze in great detail in my book, and I deconstruct it and I go through it. So the idea there is there are these guys who have an already off-the-shelf program on what to do. And when one reads that document, the BRIC, today, it is not an extremist document at all. In fact, it considers the option of having Yugoslavia-type companies, firms. Import duties are going to be on average 30%. And there's going to be some price controls, and very rapidly the Chicago Boys realized that Pinochet was giving them leeway, and they could go further, and they did that. And in the process, they made the huge mistake of fixing the exchange rate, and then there was this huge currency crisis in 1982, which under any normal political system would have meant the end of the Chicago Boys as an option. But because there was a dictatorship, Pinochet, after flirting with some old-fashioned populists, came back to the Chicago Boys. Not the same people, a younger generation, which is in the book I call the pragmatic neoliberals. And what they do is that they take the approach that I just mentioned. The exchange rate is the main lever, is the main incentive. The exchange rate plus the rule of law. Okay.
This is Pinera, and
this is Herman Bici more than Piñera. Piñera is behind. Jose Piñera is behind all of this. Very, very, very bright, and he is the father of two very important pieces of legislation: the pensions reform that creates these private savings accounts that we mentioned earlier for retirement, which did not or have not delivered what people expected them to deliver, and the mining law, well, and also the labor law. So there are three very important keys that Piñera is responsible for. In fact, in the book, I say the first phase of the Chicago Boys in Chile, it's sort of a run-of-the-mill pro-market corrective program. And then in 1979, under Piñera's influence, Pinochet gives a very important speech called the 7 Modernizations. Now, why 7? Because Mao in China had given a speech called the 4 Modernizations.
he didn't know it was from Mao, though.
No, Piñera told the legend, and I've asked Jose, and he hasn't denied it. The legend is that he told Piñera told Pinochet, Mao has 4 modernizations. General, you must have more than 4. Let's make it 7. And that's and what the 7 modernizations do is that they say the market is now working in economics, but we're not going to expand it, and we're going to apply market principles to pensions, health, education, water rights, agriculture, and by extension, culture, the arts, and so on. So I say the beginning of the actual neoliberal model, where markets are used to solve almost every problem in society, is 1979 with the 7 modernization speech. And that process, that ends with the 1982 currency crisis, which is the one that we have to look to understand or to try to forecast what will happen in Argentina. And then the concertación, we go back to democracy in 1990. And I say, as you point out, that the new government were cabinet ministers at first, and then presidents are people who have been detained and tortured by the military, and they maintain the model. And in some areas, they even deepen and I call that phase inclusive neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. So I say, as the character of any good novel, neoliberalism in Chile evolves through time. It's not the same. It's not rigid. I mean, You want Tolstoy's characters evolve through time. Those who are nasty at first and they become lovingly, and so on and so forth. So that's my view. And Chile has had a long story of neoliberalism.
But the book is also a story of what I think of as knowledge transfer, technology transfer, right? And you point out that at the beginning of the book, right, in the 1950s, the quality of university education in the world of economics in Chile and presumably in other parts of Latin America was pretty poor. And most people traveled abroad to learn economics. And there was this initiative that was launched by the US government to kind of help build academic capacity in economics, which is the sort of birth of the whole Chicago boy thing. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this. And it's almost accidental that it was Chicago, right? It could have been presumably any university that had this partnership with Católica, right, that led to all of this.
It could and it couldn't. So there was supply and demand here as always, right? So there are two key characters from the what I will call the supply side, and those were Ted Schultz, the famous agricultural economist and longtime chairman at Chicago, and the Nobel Prize winner eventually, I think in '79.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an advisor for IDA, which is a precursor of USAID, on agricultural issues and in Latin America. And what Ted concluded after a few years, remember that foreign aid becomes part of U.S. foreign policy only around
the fight against communism.
Around 45. Not earlier. There was disaster assistance. So if there was an earthquake in Costa Rica or Nicaragua or Honduras, there would be assistance. But as part of foreign policy, this comes with the Point 4 Truman speech, and USAID and the precursor IDA. So Ted is going around the countries, different countries, teaching farmers the crop rotation, the use of fertilizers, and so on and so forth. And he realizes that the agricultural sector will never take off if the overall economic policy of the countries are awful, like undervalued, overvalued exchange rates and import duties on machinery and so on. So he says we need to modernize the economy as a whole. And then he realizes that there are no good economists in most of these countries, or all of them. And then he meets with the IDA fellow, Albion Patterson, Pat Patterson, also a Princeton grad, and they come to the notion, let's train a few economists in the US, and they will in turn train other economists, and there will be this sort of multiplying effect, and we will get good economists that could run these countries' economics. And because Ted was the chairman of the Department of Economics at Chicago, he wanted this to happen at Chicago. There was going to be a grant from the U.S. government, and there was going to be overhead that, and it was interesting intellectually and so on and so forth. So that's Chicago. The Catholic University at the same time, students are beginning to complain because training is very poor. And what they're basically being taught are rudiments of business administration.
But wait, wasn't it University of Chile that was originally?
It was involved. We can get into that, but let's get to Católica first. Okay, so what the capstone course, the final exam, they had to blindfolded students just by touching had to know what kind of textile of cloth they were talking about. Whether it was linen or cotton, or it had, I don't know, artificial fiber. I don't know if there was nylon already at that time. And why was that important? Because every different cloth fabric had a different import tariff. So most of these people would end up working in import-export, and they had to know whether they are, or they had to bribe or convince the customs agent that what they were importing was a fabric that had a 10% tariff when really it was a 100% tariff. So students started to complain, and they wrote to the rector, the archbishop, and told him, we want to have some kind of agreement with a foreign state university. And they mentioned Chicago and MIT, because there was a graduate who had, I think he was an engineer, and had ended up studying business at MIT. So Católica wants either Chicago or MIT. The U.S. wants only Chicago, so that's how it happens. The agreement is signed in 56, 55 or 56, and it has two very important clauses. The first one is that Católica makes a commitment of hiring 4 of the graduates who are going to get masters, not PhDs, 4 of the graduates as full-time faculty. So this is the idea that you are training in the US people that were going to train other people in Chile who in turn are going to train. So you have this multiplying effect. And the second clause is that you will pay them market salaries. Okay, and so that's the way they come back to Católica, the first graduates, and they are 25, 26. They have masters from Chicago, and they are very bold. And the first year, they flunk 100% of the students, 100%. Why? Because they don't know how to calculate a covariance. Okay, and they don't know what a t-statistic is, and what a chi-square is, and so on. And everyone is flunked. So they are called by the archbishop and says, you cannot do this. And they say, well, we already did it. And he said, you guys don't understand. We are educating the daughters and sons of the wealthy, who are going to bequeath their land and their buildings to the church. But if we flank the sons and daughters, the church, it's not going to get all that wealth. And they said, well, they have to learn how to do the covariance. Otherwise, they will not pass. And that's the way it works. And they start training these economists. And then there is this clash with the national university that where the professors are either Marxists or structuralists, very much in the vein of CEPAL, ECLA, the Economic Commission for Latin America, Raúl Prebisch, import substitution, high import tariff protectionism. Inflation doesn't matter that much. Inflation is not a monetary phenomenon. It has to do with the fact that the agricultural sector is not responsive to incentives and so on. So that's the intellectual milieu where all of this is happening. And as you say, it's really very, very interesting. And these people go to Chicago and they don't take for credit Milton Friedman's class, but they sit on his courses. Mm-hmm. I think that only 1 or 2 take his course. And only one of the Chicago boys I would say 50 or more, that while Milton is still in Chicago, only one works with him in his dissertation. So Friedman is a little detached. The real hands-on person is Arnold Harberger, who turned 100 last year. He's still with us. We went to see him when he turned 100, and it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, but while they adopted a lot of the policies that were advocated by Milton Friedman, particularly related to freeing up pricing and getting rid of tariffs and so forth, there was one thing that Friedman was very insistent on, which had to do with floating rates, and they didn't seem to absorb that piece. I mean, what is it with fixed rates, and why is it that we still see this, I don't know, addiction or compulsion to maintain fixed rates? I mean, we see this, as you mentioned, even in Argentina, there's a reluctance to fully free up the exchange rate. So what explains that?
Okay, so there are 2 different questions there. One is what happened with the Chicago boys in Chile in the 70s and 80s. And the second one is what's happening in Argentina. So Milton Friedman, of course, was, in general, there's a lot of granularity in this story. In general, Friedman was a supporter of floating rates, and he writes his famous 1950 paper, "The Case for Flexible Exchange Rates." And he gets that idea from some of his colleagues and professors from Chicago, Lloyd Mintz and Henry Simons. Okay, so it's not completely original, but he's very, very strong in that view. Now, in 1956, there's a young economist who is a postdoc in Chicago, who coincides with the early Chicago boys, and his name is Robert Mandel. Mm-hmm. And he is hired back as faculty in Chicago.
Who also won Nobel Prize.
He got the Nobel Prize as well. So he is hired back as a faculty in Chicago in the 1960s, 65, 66. And he's not there for too long, but he coincides with Harry Johnson, who did not get the Nobel Prize, but was very influential at his time, who also favors fixed exchange rates. So Mandel is fixed rates, and so is Harry Johnson. Friedman is floating rates, and both are Chicago. All of both views are Chicago, right? We associate Friedman with Chicago, but Mandel is also fundamentally a Chicago person and very influential in the sense that he trains Michael Musa, he trains Rudy Dornbusch, he trains Jacob Frenkel, that new generation of international economists who are exercise their influence in different ways. Frenkel and Musa were chief economists at the IMF. Rudy trained Ken Rogoff, Paul Krugman. I mean, a whole bunch of brilliant international economists. So you have these two views. And in 73, Friedman changes his support for flexible rates for developing countries. He gives a very famous lecture, or I think it's famous, the Horowitz lecture in Israel. And he says, yes, floating rates in advanced countries and immutable fixed rates in less developed countries. And by that, he means currency boards or dollarization.
Yeah. So something similar to what Cavallo tried to implement in Argentina later. Right?
Yeah. I don't know if Cavallo had read the Horowitz lecture by Friedman, because Friedman then writes about Argentina, but after the crisis of '81 in Argentina, right?
Well, I guess similar to Hong Kong, right?
2001.
So Hong Kong had a working currency board throughout all this period.
Yeah.
Right?
So Friedman starts writing a lot about Hong Kong, and in the crisis, the Hong Kong crisis. He works on it, and he helps the Hong Kong government to stabilize the exchange rate and so on. But anyway, so the intellectual background of this fixed versus floating, it's granular, right? It's not straightforward. So why do the Chicago boys adopt fixed rates in Chile? It's through Bob Mandel and Harry Johnson, and transmitted through another faculty member who was very close to the Chicago boys, Larry Shasta. And somehow, I think, and I say this in the book, things get lost in translation. Okay, and Larry he's a good economist and a very good guy, but he's not the same caliber as the other guys we're talking about. And so you have here young Chilean graduates who are now getting most of their advice from Larry Shasta, and they are very busy trying to make things work, and they apply the fixed rate in a way that even at the time it was obvious that it was not going to work. Now, Friedman writes a little paper which he only publishes in a book called Monetary Mischiefs, where he compares the failed Chilean attempt at fixed rates with Israel's successful use of fixed rates under Michael Bruno, the governor of the Bank of Israel. And this is what I tell my friends in Argentina they have to read, right? So it comes from the main guru's own pen, and he compares Chile and Israel. And the key, of course, is letting the fixed rate go in time. And we don't know when that optimal time is. And that's what the Argentines call eliminating the cepo. They use the word cepo, which is, I don't know what the exact translation into English, but it's like handcuffs, right? So, and it basically means allowing capital controls, eliminating capital controls and allowing capital mobility. And you only want to do that carefully. I mean, you want to avoid a stampede of dollars out of the country. And I guess you also want to avoid a stampede of dollars into the country, because that will further strengthen the currency and damage exports. So I think that the Argentinians are doing it quite right, because they are eliminating taxes on exports, on agricultural exports. So the net return, ag exports in Argentina are being hurt by a stronger currency in real terms, but they are being benefited because they don't have to pay export taxes. And Federico Sturzenegger, who is Freddie, the Minister of Deregulation, is deregulating at a pace and in enough depth for productivity to blossom. So you have productivity gains and no taxes on exports that may, very important, may offset the strengthening of the currency. And so the verdict on Argentina is open. Every day that passes, I am more optimistic, but I wouldn't bet the house on them making it. If they make it, Argentina will be unstoppable, at least for a while, because it's a country with tremendous potential in terms of natural resources, in terms of everything. I mean, the Argentine people are extremely talented. It's just that politicians are awful. I mean, normal Argentine people are as talented as Argentine soccer players, which means that they are the most talented in the world, right?
Yeah, I just got back from Argentina about a week ago, and I was in Argentina in 2001 during the 5 presidents. And, I think one thing that's different about what Milei is doing is, I mean, he seems to have somehow imposed fiscal discipline. And this is what was missing in the 1990s under Menem. I mean, if we go back to that time period where they had the currency board, I mean, how did they think it was there any economic theory that would support the notion that they could just run unlimited deficits? I mean, it seems like a modern monetary theory, except without the capacity to print money, right? Which is a key ingredient. How did the people in Argentina during the 90s think that they could sustain a fixed rate without any fiscal discipline?
Well, they let the fiscal discipline go after the first 2 years, right? And the theory is that if you're going to have a fixed exchange rate, you need a number of ingredients for it to work. One is that the wages have to be very flexible, right? Because when there is an external shock and you need adjustment, relative prices have to move. And they move either because the exchange rate moves or because the wages move. And the second requirement is that you need a counter-cyclical fiscal policy to run a surplus during the good years and a deficit during the bad years. And they didn't do either. So it was, in my view, it was clear from early on that this was not going to succeed. And the crisis was extremely, extremely costly.
Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at situations like Argentina and we see them default and devalue and renege on their commitments and seize bank accounts and so forth, we think, oh, well, that's banana republic behavior. But in your book, American default, you talk about how we did exactly that here in the U.S. And what I found, I mean, I studied economic history and financial history, and so I'm well aware of this story. But you said that when you mention what happened in the 30s to your colleagues, they don't believe it. They don't seem to appreciate that the U.S. has defaulted on its debts.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, the economic historians, of course, as they know about the episode. They don't know or didn't know the details, which is what I unearth, and I tell the story in the book after going through dozens of archives. What I do in the book is dig really in depth into it and go into the Supreme Court reasoning in saying that it was okay to retroactively eliminate the gold clause, imposing 41% losses on holders of government and private bonds.
Mm-hmm. And it was that revocation of the gold clauses, right? The annulment of those gold clauses that was the key thing, right? Because it wasn't simply reneging on public debts. It was basically saying that every single contract that was ever been written, even with provisions that attempted to write contracts in some objective non-dollar unit, these things were now null and void.
Right. So, I mean, the public debts were paid in paper dollars, although the contracts were signed in gold dollars. And the price of gold had been $20.67 since 1834. It had been $19.60 since the mint was created in 1834. Then there was an adjustment because the ratio of gold to silver was wrong in the US, or was different than Europe, and that created arbitrage opportunities that were destabilizing. So for 100 years, we had the same exchange rate relative to gold, except that, of course, there was no full convertibility during the Civil War, but it came back, right? And in 1917, the law that allowed the government to issue the Liberty bonds to finance World War I expressly said that all bonds had to be in gold terms. They couldn't be in paper dollars. So railways, utilities, large mortgage issuers, and the government debt was all in dollar terms. And FDR was told by someone, maybe Joseph Kennedy, not an economist. He had very few economists around him. Was told, look, the UK devalued the pound relative to gold in September 31, and it seems to be working. So why don't we? And he said, well, let's devalue the dollar. And then he was told, hold on, every debt is in gold terms, so everyone will go bankrupt, including the government. And FDR said, well, we being the Democratic Party, we control the Senate and the House by very wide margins. Let's pass a law abrogating the gold clause. We can do whatever we want. And that's what they did on June 5th, 1933. Like 15 months later, 18 months later, in February 35, the Supreme Court ruled that was okay. And the book tells a story. It's much more complicated than what I'm saying. But basically, the Supreme Court said, yes, you can do that. And yes, people will be paid in paper dollars, even though the contract said that you had to be paid in gold dollars. The price of gold had gone from $20.67 an ounce to $35, the famous $35 an ounce that lasted until August 15, 1971, right? When finally Nixon got off the gold.
But what was surprising to me was sort of how improvisational the decision-making was, right? It didn't seem like Roosevelt had a plan when he was inaugurated. It was sort of let's try some stuff out. I mean, the brain trust that he had, like, Burrell and Tugwell and these guys, I mean, these were not sort of the leading economists of their time. I mean, there's Frank Knight and all those folks were sort of sidelined. I mean, I guess in some ways, was it a good thing that they didn't have the economists? I mean, why didn't Hoover do this? Presumably Hoover could have done the exact same thing. Was it that his advisors thought it was impossible, or
well, there was a big discussion about doing it, and in fact, there was the undersecretary of the Treasury was a guy called Arthur Ballantyne, who had drafted legislation which was used to do this. And Hoover wanted to do it, and at the end of his term, he met with FDR and told him, let's do something along these lines, including the banking holiday of the first week of March. But I need legal cover. That's what Hoover said. So I need you to sign a letter saying that you agree, and that as soon as you get on board, you're going to pass legislation that says that it's okay to close the banks and to do this. Do this meaning abrogating the gold clause or devaluing the dollar. And FDR refused, and he told Herbert Hoover, you are president until March 3rd at noon. That's when I take over, and I will see what I do when I take over. And that's what happened. But the idea of doing the banking holiday of the first week of 33, when a lot of banks were not reopened, right? Because the idea was to clean up the financial sector. Doing that and the getting off gold, which happened a few weeks later, all of that was done legally under the umbrella of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. And we were not at war with anyone. We had no enemies. Okay,
a little bit of a legal stretch.
Right. So the Trading with the Enemy Act allowed the federal government to close banks and to do all sorts of things in order to protect the gold stock of the United States during World War I. And that is the legal authority that the government used, the FDR government. And the idea had started under Hoover to do it. So the whole story is fascinating. And as you say, there were very few economists. The only economist that brings trust is Rex Taxwell, who at the time is enamored of the Soviet Union. He's a professor at Columbia, but they don't allow him to teach graduate courses. He only teaches in the college. And he's the author of a very well-known and widely used college textbook on economics, right? But the other two senior members of the Brains Trust, Ray Moley, he's a lawyer or a political scientist, also a professor at Columbia, and Adolf Burley, he's a lawyer, a very famous lawyer, who then becomes at some point ambassador to Brazil. And in the research for my new book, he reappears as a very important character in designing the JFK's policy towards Cuba. Okay, so JFK has to decide what to do after the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in April of '61, what to do about Cuba. And then he calls some of the Democratic Party old hands on Latin America, and Adolf Burl is one of them. Right? So it's things get intertwined.
Well, now you also cite, McReynolds at the Supreme Court and some others, they were saying that if we did this would destroy the credibility of the dollar, destroy the credibility of America and its capacity to uphold contracts and so forth. And yet it didn't. Right. Whereas when we look at, say, Argentina and what Argentina did, they lost all credibility. So what was the difference here? Why is it that the U.S. is it simply that the U.S. is the most powerful country on earth? Or is it, as you say, this idea that it was sort of an excusable default? Everybody understood that it was an exogenous event.
I think that the notion of excusable default is important. If there is an act of God, and the Great Depression was thought to be, in part at least, an act of God, that was one element. The other one is that I think that the Supreme Court rulings were very detailed and pedagogical, and they explained that aspect of the justifiable default in a clear way. And the third one is that the devaluation was very large, from $20.67 to 35. So the problem with Latin America is that most devaluation crises are very timid. The Mexican peso in 95, was it 95? 94, 95. It went from 330 to 4, right? And today is 20, right? The Argentine peso went from parity 1-to-1 to 3 or 2.5. Today is 1,000. Right? In the case of the dollar, it was so large, it was sort of an overshooting that people expected that if anything, it would come back down, the price of gold, rather than go up. And there were huge inflows of gold into the U.S. And the Fed did not sterilize and allowed the money supply to increase. And that went on until 37, when the Fed panics and start making adjustments. And then we have the recession of 37, right? But what is interesting, Greg, and if you read the book, you remember, is that the Supreme Court makes different rulings for the private debt and for the government debt. So the private debt, they say, it's very easy. The Constitution gives the right to Congress of minting currency and setting the value thereof. And if to comply and to run that, or to exercise that power, the Congress decides to annul retroactively private contracts, it's fine. So that's one ruling. And that has to do with railways and so on and so forth. And then there is the issue of the Liberty Bond. There's a Liberty Bond case, and they are concurrent, right? And what the Supreme Court says is, yes, the Constitution gives Congress the right to determine the value of the dollar, but it also says that Congress has to make sure that the U.S. pays its debts. That's the 14th Amendment. And when two powers or two obligations in the Constitution contradict each other, you cannot use one to annul the other. And then they decide that it's not constitutional to abrogate the gold clause in the Liberty Bond. It's unconstitutional. And then comes the brilliant thing. They say, however, there's no damage and there should be no payment. And why isn't there damage? And it's the first time that in a Supreme Court case, there are graphs and index numbers. And they argue that the $10,000 that the investor, I forget his name, whose case was actually the one that was brought to the court, the $10,000 that he had spent buying that bond in 1920, today, at the new currency value, had a greater purchasing power than the original value because of disinflation during the Depression. And what mattered is the purchasing power. And they say there's no damage because you can purchase now at least as much as you could purchase when you bought the bond. So it's unconstitutional, but there's no damage.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's been able to cite that in other contract cases. But I mean, going back to the Chile book, I mean, this book also has a sort of an updated portion where you talk about the events of 2019, right, and the malestar and so forth. And you said that these events caught a lot of people off guard, and a lot of people just couldn't understand, right? Why are people protesting? Especially why they're protesting over such a tiny increase in, subway fares and so forth. I mean, a lot of people were we're caught off guard. Should we have been able to forecast this? And I guess a corollary question is, there does seem to be a continued support for populism. And I mean, this is the book, right, Left Behind, and talk about how populism is still a very powerful force in Latin America. I mean, it's now, of course, a popular force everywhere. And in some ways, Latin America was sort of leading the way for the rest of us, because now I guess we're all Latin American in some ways because of the support for populism. But to what extent, I mean, should we have seen this and predicted this?
Well, I think that the vulnerability of the model, the fragility, should have been foreseen. There was the slowing down of the economy meant that, as we said earlier, people's aspirations became further and further away. And they felt that they'd been duped on a number of issues by the supporters of the model. One was pensions. They were told, if you put your money into these savings account, when you retire, you'll get at least 70% of your salary. And I personally think that it was not so hard to predict that was going to be a problem. The 70% was predicated or calculated under just three assumptions. The first one was that people worked for 40 years and contributed to their savings account for 40 years. It turns out that there's a lot of turnover, and in a country where the informal sector is large, people on average contributed only 20 years. So one half of the assumption. Mm-hmm. The contribution is 10% of your salary, and the OECD, the average is 20%. It's actually 19, but let's say 20. So you are contributing for half of the time, one half of the amount. That means 0.5 times 0.5 is 0.25. And that's exactly what the rate of replacement was, 25% of salary. Right? So could you have predicted that? Well, I think that turnover in the labor market, I have a discussion about this with my wife, who is an economist also from Chicago. She says that labor economists only focused on that in the 1990s. I think that we've known it forever. So I think that anyway, so that was one of the reasons why people were. Then there were some abuses, some scandals. I mean, to put it simply, a middle-class country like Chile, people get their proteins mostly from chicken, right? And if they get sick, they have to go to the pharmacy, and the insurance does not cover prescriptions. And what was found within 1 year was that there was collusion in the pharmacy sphere. Pharmacy chains had colluded. Chicken producers had colluded. And toilet paper producers had colluded. And then you get the whole cycle. You eat, you get sick, and then you go to the bathroom, and you are facing collusion at all points, right? So that added to the unhappiness and what is known as the malestar, right? And then there is the issue of inequality, which I think is important. And I'm saying this, I'm not sure if I said this already, not necessarily from an ethical point of view. It's from a practical political science, sociological point of view.
Well, you talk about horizontal inequality, right? Not just vertical.
Yeah. So in Chile, right? Chile is one of the most unequal countries in terms of income, but also it's very segregated. And I mean, look, 2 days ago they release the results of the SAT equivalent. Okay, so this is a college admissions test. Of the top 100 high schools in terms of scores, 98% are private academies, private schools with tuition, the equivalent of the Phillips Exeters of the US. 98 out of 100. Okay. And that's segregation in the education. So there is this horizontal inequality that that I think it's also important. And as the country developed and people get out of poverty, being treated in a disrespectful way by whiter citizens, that there's also a racial component that in Chile is not acknowledged that all the time. But being treated without respect, it's not acceptable anymore. It's people get resentful, right? So I think that all of that added to this quite unstable cocktail. And then, of course, we cannot rule out the activists. So the big demonstrations and the burning down of the different cities happened about a week or 2 weeks before the APEC was going to take place. And Xi Jinping and the U.S. president and Justin Trudeau and all these people were going to come to Chile, and we're going to discuss free trade and so on. And I think that Global Antifa was meeting in Chile and we're getting ready. And that, I think, added the mechanical. I mean, it's not easy, I assume, I don't know, to burn 27 or 35 or whatever it is metro stations simultaneously in a lapse of 3 hours, right? You need people who know how to do that. There's a production function to burn metro stations. So I think that the combination of all of that was part of the revolt of 2019 that was followed by the Constitutional Convention of 2022. And like the Gato Pardo, in order for things to change, nothing has to change, and nothing has changed.
Well, I guess last question. There was a time when the prosperity of Latin America and the prosperity of North America were very similar. And there was a time, of course, when Argentina was at, and Argentines will remind you every time you meet them that there was a time when Argentina was at European sort of standards, even higher than European standards. But then there's this whole literature that sort of says that the gap is inevitable, right? Sort of the legal origins literature, which I'm sure you know very well. I mean, is it inevitable? I mean, can we foresee a day where the gap between Latin American and North American standards have converged?
I don't know. If it happens, it will not happen during my lifetime. The one opportunity for that to have happened was Chile, and it has stalled. So in 1990, Chile's income was, I talk a little bit about this in Left Behind, my book on Latin America. And maybe I talk about it again in the Chile Project book. But in 1990, Chile's income was 19% that of the US. And it climbed to, 45%. And now it's again going back. The country that I used as a benchmark is New Zealand. New Zealand it's very far from the rest of the world, such as Chile. New Zealand has a very large indigenous population, such as Chile. It has an extensive coast. You would not believe it, but it has more coastline than Chile. Chile is long and it looks very large, but New Zealand, there are several islands and it goes around. And once you add
there's no Argentina next door.
Yeah. So Chile went up and became like almost 70% of New Zealand. And now it's again going back in terms of its comparison. So will the gap ever be closed? I think that it may, but I am not hopeful. So I think that I would be happy if we're not further left behind. Will the new champion of the World Cup be a Latin American country? Very likely, Argentina or Brazil. Will a Latin American cyclist win the Tour de France? Very likely, either from Ecuador or Colombia. So there are many. Will we have other famous architects like Cesar Pelli who designed the Reagan airport in Washington, D.C. and other big buildings? Yes, very likely. Will we catch up with the US or Canada? Unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely.
Well, Left Behind is the name of this book, which it's a couple years old, but I think it's still a fantastic book. Also, check out American Default and, of course, the Chile Project. Fantastic book. Sebastián, thanks so much for joining me, and let's talk again soon.
Greg, thank you so much. And it was, as I said, an honor, and it was very entertaining. Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.